you look at what makes us human. We are more than just a material being. We have a body, but we are a unity of body and soul. So the question is, where is, the human soul? Well, how does that come into being?
Welcome to Purposeful Lab, a Maggia Center podcast. I'm Catherine Hadra with Dr. Dan Kuebler. So here we are, season 3 again. We've been looking at biological evolution. And this episode, we're going to dive more into human evolution and better understanding all the environmental factors at play, which is important to better understand us and humans.
Right, yeah. If we want to understand humans, who they are, who we are, our purpose, and so forth, understanding the context in which humans emerge is important.
For this topic, I have the privilege to interview you. So thanks for,
Looking forward to it.
Yes, for diving into this because you've written on this topic again about human evolution. You've written the book, The Evolution Controversy, a survey of competing theories. You have a new book coming out early 2025 with Word on Fire Press about the church's view on evolution. So again, and of course, biology professor at Franciscan, where you've been, for over 20 years. So grateful to speak with you on this.
Yeah, it's going to be good to talk about this.
So I know we're going to kind of start talking about the hominin fossils, but can you first just set us up? What is a hominin?
Yeah, so what we're going to sort of talk about today is sort of what's happened in recent hominid evolution. So, about 7 million years ago, there's a common ancestor that on one branch led to modern humans, and on another branch led to modern chimps, our closest living relatives. Hominid evolution is looking at the fossil forms you find that are more closely related to modern humans than to modern chimps, right? So we're going to be looking at what happened in that lineage and what you see, what factors may have played a role, and sort of the diversity you see in hominin fossils.
So to get us started on that and looking at the patterns found in these fossil records over the past 7 million years and really discussing what that reveals and, again, all the environmental changes that influenced it. So can you give us a quick summary of this pattern that we see in these fossil records?
Yeah, this field there's a lot of active research. So the little details, they're finding new details all the time, but sort of the 30,000 foot, overview of what you see. And what you don't see is, those neat bumper stickers where you see an ape sort of gradually standing up like this, like A, go to B, go to C, this nice, neat linear progression. That's not what you see in the hominid fossil record. What you see is more of a mosaic pattern. What I mean by that is you start to see a variety of different fossil forms. Some look more modern in their brain. Others might look more modern in their jaw, right? And so you get these sort of, it's hard to put them all together, like which one is more modern, which one is more ancient, and so forth in terms of their features, because you see this sort of almost like experimentation going on
all
with
simultaneously.
So particularly if you look in Africa between 2 and 4 million years ago, there's a lot of different hominid forms in Africa that it's hard to how exactly are they all related. But what you do see is a diversity, and they are changing in ways that are getting on the path towards sort of the modern human form.
So is it fair to say if all that was going on simultaneously, was there truly a progression?
You see, on average, an increase in brain size over time. But say if you go back to 4 million years ago and look at the hominid fossil has the biggest brain size, there's going to be a larger brain than if you go back 6 million years. And if you look at the hominid fossils from 500,000 years ago, the largest brain is going to be bigger than the largest brain 2 million years ago. But at the same time, there's this mosaicness. So there was a hominid fossil found that dates to about 20,000 years ago, was found in Indonesia, and has a relatively small brain size. So it's not like every hominid fossil is going in one direction. In a sense, it's exploring the different possible ways that you can make a hominid. And out of that sort of exploration, one emerges and takes over. That's modern humans.
You mentioned, and I can totally picture it right now, that popular bumper sticker that people see of, again, it's like a chimp, and it's gradually, it's hunched over, and then it's slightly less hunched over, and then it's an upright man. But you said, again, it's not necessarily that clear progression like that. But what are the factors that would have led to, again, a more upright, big-brained human?
Yeah. So if you look at, the hominid fossil record, up until about 2 million years ago, all the hominids are found in Africa. So this is the factors that are going to drive the first stages are all going to be changes that are occurring in Africa at that time. And one of the things that major factors is changes in the climate. Okay, so two major things are happening, particularly from 5 million years ago till the present. You see two things. One, you see sort of a global cooling going on. And you also see more fluctuations in sort of global temperatures, right? So you're getting more variability in the temperatures and you're getting a global cooling. Now, what that does in Africa in particular, as the Earth cools, you get more water trapped at the poles in the ice caps, and you have sort of a drying out of the climate in Africa. And so what is that going to do? So if you think of like where chimps are in sort of a river forest, a lot of vegetation and so forth. If you start to dry out areas of Africa and you have these savannas, these plains, where you have, a different way of possibly making a living, having upright posture to travel through these savannas, having the ability to, use your arms to throw things and hunt and so forth, are going to help you survive in this drier savanna type climate. Whereas, the primates that remain in sort of the river areas are going to do well and then develop into, say, modern chimps. So there's sort of two different ways in a sense. It's more complicated than that, but sort of two different, you can see these two different paths. The hominid path is exploring this new drier climate in Africa. And there has to be some, a number of changes to be able to, know where food might be at different times of the year as you migrate from one area to the other in this new environment. And so having a larger brain can help you remember, divide up, labor, social group and so forth, and having that upright posture allows you to move more efficiently. Yeah. So one of the things, upright posture, as you move across the savanna, you're going to have a couple benefits. One, humans are very good at long distance running, right? As opposed
Speak for yourself.
Right? As opposed to other species. Yeah, and particularly like ungulates, like zebras and things like that. The game that they would have in Africa, and so having the ability to be upright and to run, they can actually outrun. Even if they go at a moderate pace, can outrun these ungulates, and then they get really overheated and fall over. Whereas humans with this upright posture, they have an easier time dissipating heat, and they can run better. They can hunt better in this savanna environment. So
you mentioned this, cooling period that happened. So is that the ice age that you're referring to?
Well, the cooling period, it started about 50 million years ago, and particularly accelerated maybe the last 2.5 million years ago. But what you see is not just a cooling of the temperature. You see these big fluctuations, right? And so you see these glacial periods and then the interglacial periods. So you would have, say, the ice age, and then you'd have the inter-ice age. And there was a cycle roughly about every 100,000 years that you would go through this, right? And right now we're in this interglacial period for the last 11,000 years or so. But, having to survive these dramatic changes in climate, having more developed social structure, a bigger brain, allowed to adapt to these changes in the environment could help drive, hominid evolution towards a large brain social hominid.
Would something like humans have evolved without this cyclical dramatic change in the environment, like you're describing? Or again, are humans just a chance product of a chance environmental happening?
Yeah, so clearly, in the way evolution has played out in the last 7 million years, there's certain environmental factors that have triggered, and helped shape the human form over hominid evolution time. Had the environment changed differently, maybe the form would have been slightly different. But there's something about, I think, a large-brained hominid, like you and I, that has an advantage over other ways of making a living, and so had the environment changed slightly differently, I think eventually, where there's lots of environmental change going on over time, that you would emerge some large-brained, primate that's upright. It might have been a different pattern, different timing, and so forth, I think it's something like that would have emerged. That's something that, we've had Simon Conway Morris on before, and he talks about that in his book Life Solutions. That there's this convergent evolution. So this is the factors that drove human evolution this time. Had it been slightly different, well, the pathway might have been different, but we probably would have, through this mosaic experimentation, come up with a form that's very similar, not identical, but similar.
You mentioned Africa and how hominins were present in Africa, and they were only found in Africa until about 2 million years ago. Why did hominins leave Africa? Can you speak about that?
Yeah. So up until 2 million years ago, the hominids are exclusively in Africa. Now some of them start to leave Africa, then, and some hominins obviously who are still in Africa
Right.
During that time. But for whatever reason, about 2 million years ago, the first sort of wave, this is Homo erectus, leaves Africa and heads into Asia, right? And so they don't, go into Europe, which was probably too cold at the time. But why? It's a great question. I think there's something, about as they can migrate, the long distance migration became part and parcel of the sort of the hominid forms. And you see this wave of hominids leave Africa 2 million years ago. You see another wave that leaves and gives rise to Neanderthals about 500,000 years ago. And then finally, you see a wave leaving Africa of modern humans about 50,000 years ago that then colonizes basically the whole globe other than Antarctica. So there's something in our DNA of this wanderlust of wanting to go explore, and it's something that we find in our hominin ancestors too.
You mentioned Neanderthals already, and they're fascinating for a number of reasons. Can you first explain, what do you mean by Neanderthals exactly, and how are they related to humans, and where did they end up?
Yeah, so Neanderthals, the lineage leading to them and humans separated about 500,000 years, like 500,000 years ago. And they leave Africa into the Middle East, and they eventually make their way into Europe. And so they were able to colonize Europe while the earlier, like Homo erectus, when they left, they didn't. And they seem to have a larger, more robust form that they were better suited and adapted for the colder climate in Europe, most likely. And they're really fascinating because when modern humans leave Africa, they encounter Neanderthals, and Neanderthals were still there. They don't disappear until roughly 30,000 years ago. So, when modern humans leave Africa, there's a number of hominid forms that they would have encountered. They weren't the only hominid form on the planet, and so there's a lot of interesting things that about the interactions between Neanderthals and modern humans.
Remember, I've asked you in a previous episode how my DNA test showed up. I have Neanderthal DNA, and I'm like, what is this about? So why did they end up the way that they did eventually, Neanderthals?
Why did they end up in Europe? Yeah, so they're again, the idea is that there's a niche there in Europe, so there is no hominids, and so they were able to take over and make a living there. Maybe they have a larger brain than, say, Homo erectus, and so maybe that allowed them, and a larger body that allowed them to adapt to this climate that other hominids weren't able to successfully adapt to.
So as we're looking through this process of human biological evolution and getting a little bit closer to modern human culture, the modern human form, my understanding is it seemed to emerge in Africa 200,000 to 300,000 years ago. Is that right? So what do we know about those first modern humans?
Yeah, we don't know that much about those first modern humans, but if you look at the fossil record, it's in Africa that you see the emergence of fossils that look relatively similar to the fossils, to you and I, right? And sort of the oldest of there's some fossils at about 300,000 years old that are found in Morocco, so like Northwest Africa. And then there's some that are about 200,000 years old that are found in Ethiopia. And they look similar. The ones that are 300,000 years old, they have about the same brain size as modern humans, but the shape of the brain is a little bit different. It's a little flatter and more elongated. And so, exactly, what their behavior differences were versus the fossils you find 200,000 years ago, it's not clear. But there is this, the forms start in Africa. So you don't see like early modern humans in Asia first, right? So the earliest ones are in Africa. So it's the idea that modern humans emerged in Africa somewhere between 300 and 200,000 years ago. And we say that, we're talking about biological humans, the humans that biologically look like you and I, right?
I'm thinking about signs of human culture. So thinking of, pictures I've seen in old history textbooks of jewelry that humans had made years ago, or again, cave paintings. When did we first start to see that emerge? And can you speak to that aspect of our human evolution?
Humanity. So, we talk about, like you mentioned, about biological humans right. That physically, okay, they're similar enough to you and I. We'll call them Homo sapiens biologically. The other question, this is one I think is more interesting, so is when do you see humans that are like us in terms of their behaviors, right? And I think, have this particularly the symbolic thought and language and so forth, that how do you know when that emerges?
Okay, so you've talked about modern humans emerged 200 to 300,000 years ago. When did we first start to see signs of culture, though? I'm thinking of, old history textbook photos of cave art.
Right.
When did that start emerging?
Yeah, interestingly, there's a lot of debate in the archaeological record because you have to interpret these things. But most people tend to agree that you see sort of clear signs of sort of human culture, these artifacts that you say, well, whoever made that got the same sort of rational conceptual thought that you and I do, right? You start to see that maybe 100,000 to 50,000 years ago. You start to see signs of that. One of the best examples is Blunda's Cave in South Africa, where you see a couple things. You see these shells that have holes drilled into them at the exact same point that is thought to have been used for shell jewelry, right? You see ochre, which is an iron sort of clay pigment that has regular sort of markings on it that seem to be very intentional, have maybe meaning behind them. And you see this elsewhere as well, sort of sporadically during that time period, right? So it's somewhere in that. Now, just because you don't see it doesn't mean it wasn't there before. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, right? So maybe we just haven't found, in the archaeological record signs of this earlier. And there are some signs of it earlier. It just depends on how you interpret them. Some people overinterpret certain things. Some people underinterpret. And we don't have them there to interrogate. We can't ask these people what this thing was for, and so forth.
So what was going on with the human evolution process that now culture is showing itself about 150,000 years ago?
Yeah. So around 100,000 to 50,000 years ago, you start to see this. And then from 50,000 on, you start to see, all of these cave paintings in particular, the things that you're talking about in your textbooks. You see those. And you see those all over the globe. You see them in Indonesia. You see them in Europe. So it's not like, oh, they all start here and spread out. They just sort of seem to show up all over the place. And I think, what most likely occurred is that you have different human populations living in different places, and they're developing cultures, and then they're interacting with different human groups. So there's, exchange of cultures and information and so forth. And then out of this starts to emerge what we would recognize as sort of human culture, art and artifacts, and it sort of explodes over time. Eventually, you hit a critical mass where this sort of human artifacts explode everywhere. Right?
So would you say that's the explanation why there is this delay between the emergence of modern humans and then the emergence of this culture?
Yeah, I think that it's indication that they've gotten to that point where, just because you have the potential, say, to do calculus, right, doesn't mean, the humans that lived 10,000 years ago had the potential to do calculus. They just didn't have the culture and the learning to get that, right? And so it's the same thing, like the humans that existed, 100,000 years ago may have had the ability to do art, but hadn't, you had the culture where that became part of their culture, right? The potential was there, right? So you have a human form that live in Africa that have maybe the potential to do this, but it's not actualized until human culture starts to develop over time. And that can be a slow process, and then it starts to emerge, more recently than, say, the biological form that we recognize as humans.
So these are, modern humans we're talking about, but what do we know about other hominins? It's said that Neanderthals even had burial practices.
Yeah. Yeah, Neanderthals are really interesting, the hominid species, because modern humans interacted with them. There was good evidence that we interbred with Neanderthals. And in addition to that, there is some evidence that, that Neanderthals, had burial practices. Now, whether that means they had symbolic thought, maybe they're just, taking a corpse and burying it because it smells bad,
For practical reasons.
Right? Did they have a belief in the afterlife? It's not clear. But there is, cave paintings in Europe that date to before modern humans got there, that are thought to have been made by Neanderthals. Now, they're not as robust as paintings that are known to have been made by earlier humans. But there's a question there: what type of abilities did Neanderthals have, right? And obviously, modern humans, when they left Africa, interbred with Neanderthals, and so we've talked about before. We have picked up some genes from Neanderthals, genes that might help us survive in colder climates or and survive certain pathogens that they were exposed to in Europe before modern humans get there. So they're a very interesting, species because of their interaction with us and because of sort of a lot of they're almost doing the same thing, but not that you don't see the full flourishing that you see in modern humans, in the last 50,000 years.
Just for my context, when did they die out? When was the end of
Neanderthals? By 30,000 years ago. So modern humans leave Africa. Modern humans left Africa back and forth, over the last 200,000 years. But the last wave that left Africa about 50,000 years ago, that's the wave that seemed to displace all the other hominid species on the planet. That's the one that ended up getting to Australia, getting to the New World. That one goes into Europe, and the Neanderthals disappear about 30,000 years ago. So there was, this overlap with that last wave. Exactly what drove the Neanderthals to extinction? Did they just get assimilated? Did they get outcompeted? Were there diseases that modern humans brought? There's a lot of different ideas and theories what drove the Neanderthals to extinction.
So we've talked about this relationship between modern humans and Neanderthals and how we carry some of their DNA still. This relationship, what connection is there? Okay, both biologically, but also spiritually. Can you speak about that dynamic?
Yeah. So, when you think about what makes modern humans distinct from other forms, it's our rationality. What makes us different is that we can have language and conceptual thought, and we can think about things that are not material. We're not sort of stuck in the material where we can think about concepts like, justice or fairness or a perfect circle, which doesn't exist in the world. So we have this ability to think about and judge our own actions and so forth. So the question is, did Neanderthals have that same ability, right? And it's not clear whether they did or not. If they did, then they would be, in a sense, human in the same way we are human, meaning that they have rational conceptual thought. And maybe, the Neanderthals that we interbred with, are similar enough to us to be considered, humans in the sense that they're made in the image and likeness of God, right? Which is really, what does that mean? Is that you have this rational conceptual thought, as a spiritual soul that allows you to be in communion with God. That's a question that science can't answer, but it does give clues about what Neanderthals were able to do. I mean, they were able to do it seems like, some significant things, but what were they exactly like us? It doesn't seem that way, but it's very much a gray area, I think.
Well, to that point, I mean, how does that all mesh with the Christian understanding of the creation of man? You said there's a limit to what science can explain.
Yeah. So science, when you look at what makes us human, right? We are more than just a material being. We have a material a body, but we are a unity of body and soul. So the question is, where is the human soul? Where does that enter the process? How does that come into being? And I would say, the evolutionary process, the process of hominid evolution produces the form at some point that's fitting to receive a rational soul, to be the human that can be in relation with God. Exactly when that happened, I can't say, oh, that happened 60,000 years ago. That happened 100,000 years ago. I think it certainly would have happened, before, you see, cave paintings and so forth 50,000 years ago. So I would argue it had to happen somewhere before then. Exactly when, and it probably happened in Africa because that's where you see, the oldest modern humans. So sometime in Africa, the form emerges that's fitting to receive a rational soul, right? With that, you have the abilities, right? They might not be manifest immediately, but you have the abilities to do all the things that we associate with humans and modern human culture.
You cite Pope Benedict XVI pretty frequently on this topic because he would write and speak about the topic of evolution. But Pope Benedict XVI, he talks about creation and evolution when looking at the origin of man. So for many people, though, there's that juxtaposition that seems incoherent. Again, both evolution and creation. What did Pope Benedict XVI mean by this? And does that fit in with what you just talked about with human evolution?
Yeah, no, why he uses that is that, evolution, understanding of human evolution is going to give us some information about what it means to be human, the human body, our relationship to other hominins and other primates, and the way, that we make a living and our physiology and so forth, and when that might emerge. But that alone can't explain all there is about the human person, right? And that's where the creation aspect, that we are made in the image and likeness of God, right? So, whatever the evolutionary process that got to produce the form, there was a creation event in the sense that God directly creates the human soul, and the first humans that come into being. That form has evolved, but once it's there, it's now ensouled, that there's a creation event. So it's creation and the evolution, to understand how you get that first human form.
As we're talking about human evolution, a question kind of comes to mind. Are we still evolving? And if so, are we continuing to evolve into a different species?
Yeah. No, that's a great question. And I get that question a lot when I give talks or from my students. Yeah. And it's clearly we're still evolving in the sense that we have, genetic changes in populations that occur. So you have, changes in our lactose tolerance. So you have changes in immune resistance and disease susceptibility genes and so forth. So clearly there is that. I think the question that people are getting at, are we evolving into Uberman, something else, right? What is there? And from my perspective, right? Again, this is to realize what are the limits of evolution. I don't think like our ability to have rational conceptual thought, what makes us different from, is not fully a material thing, right? So it is, there's a material aspect to our person that is the type of thing that is fitting to receive a rational soul, and then allows us to have a rational conceptual thought. And so, I don't think we can evolve beyond that because it's not a physical thing. It's certainly dependent upon our brain size and so forth and things like that. But it goes beyond that. So I don't see us, we might evolve to have more intelligence and so forth, but we're still a rational creature that's in relation with God. I don't think that's something that evolution is going to move us beyond, for example.
Sometimes I wonder, just with technology and how much our face is in front of screens all the time, I sometimes wonder if that's going to affect just human evolution and how we continue to evolve. For someone who wants to learn more about this topic in particular, are there any sources you'd want to point them towards to delve even more deeply?
Yeah, I think if you're just interested in trying to get your mind wrapped around what we know about human evolution and maybe the origins of humans from a scientific perspective, Ian Tattersall has a number of books. Masters of the Planet is one of those. I don't agree with everything he has in there, but I think he does a good job of explaining, what might have occurred and this. And Yuval Harari also has a book as well called Sapiens, and it does sort of the same thing. And it's it's called, I think, A Brief History of Humankind. And that book also, I think, is, just sets the context of what we've been talking about. They don't get into the spiritual aspect, but just from the biological, this is sort of how, people have thought about, how humans emerge and the context within the modern human form emerges.
But just kind of last question as we're thinking about, and this has been fascinating just to learn about how I as a human would have evolved, any final thoughts, especially from your perspective as a Catholic biologist?
Yeah, no, I think one of the things, I mean, it's a very fascinating field, but with a lot of sort of evolutionary history, there's a lot of inferences that people have to make, and so we want to do that, cautiously and with humility, and we realize, okay, the data we find, a year from now, okay, that's going to reshape how we view human evolution in the process. So the science is going to change and evolve and develop as we get more, archaeological evidence, more genetic evidence, and so forth. But no matter what evidence we get, I think that from a Catholic perspective, however that process unfolded and where modern humans emerged, they are more than just an evolutionary adaptation, right? That we're more than that, and there's nothing in so the evolution process is inconsistent with that notion that man is made in the image and likeness of God. However that form comes to be, and all its messiness and all the different ways and processes that might be involved, that emerging out of that is the type of thing that can be in relationship with God.
You've used this term of the biological form. Yeah. Speaking, philosophically now and bringing that aspect in, would you say the soul is the biological form of the body? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, no. So people will say that the soul is the form of the body from a philosophical perspective, right? I'm not using form in that term. I'm talking about a biological form, or the biological structure is about, if we want to distinguish that. So once you get the biological structure, the biological being that is suitable to, for a rational soul, then that gives the form of the philosophically the form of the person, right? But it's two different things, right? The soul being the form of the body is one thing. I'm talking about the physical structure.
Got it. Well, thanks for being in the hot seat for this topic. But moving on now to the office hours segment of the podcast. And again, this is where people can submit questions, you tackle other questions. The theme for this office hours, though, happens to still be on this topic of the environment. So I'll just start throwing them your way. This has to do Pope Francis. He recently released a new, what's called an apostolic exhortation, which is a letter, a fancy word for a letter. And it was to build on and be a follow-up to his 2015 encyclical on the environment called Laudate Si. So this new letter he released called Laudate Deum, which translates to praise God. And in it, he's very critical of people who deny climate change. And he says it is verifiable that specific climate changes provoked by humanity are notably heightening the probability of extreme phenomena that are increasingly frequent and intense. So he really didn't mince his words on this topic of climate change. What was your read of this letter, Laudate Deum? And as a Catholic biologist, what do you think the Catholic approach to climate change and the environment should be?
Yeah, no, I think, from a Catholic perspective, I think you would find, broad agreement amongst Catholics that we have a duty to steward our environment, that nobody really wants to just despoil the environment, right? It's relatively clear that human behavior has changed the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere, and that's having effects on the climate. And, some people say, well, look, like we talked about here, the climate changes all the time. It changed during human evolution, and there's nothing we can do about that. And I don't think that's a healthy perspective. But this is a bigger question, So, I think the church can point out, we have to steward the environment. Exactly how is extremely complex, and just one decision that we think is going to be good might have some adverse consequences over here. So it's a really, difficult issue to struggle with. If you think about electric vehicles, okay, well, that can reduce CO2 emissions, but then that creates, all the mining for the cobalt and nickel that is needed for those batteries can create other environmental problems. So it's a very, multi-layered thing that we have to get to. But I do think, from a Catholic perspective, all Catholics, I think, would agree that we have a duty to steward the environment and to ensure that we protect the environment.
A lot of prudential judgment into what that looks like for every person. Yeah. Similar topic. So ahead of Pope Francis releasing this letter on the environment, Pew Research Center, they released new data specifically about U.S. Catholic views on climate change. And broadly speaking, the views varied by political affiliation, by race, by ethnicity, by age. 82% of Catholics who are Democrat or lean Democrat, at least, say that global climate change is extremely or very serious, and that's compared to a quarter of Republicans or Republican-leaning Catholics. Were you surprised by these findings, or did it just kind of fall into predictability?
That's not too surprising given our divided culture. There are sort of mischaracterizations. I think on the one side you think, well, Republicans or these young people, older people, don't care about the environment, and I think they do. And then on the other side, you think, oh, these Democrats, all they want to do is kill the economy and take control of it. And I don't think that's the case. But I think both, you're trying to reach a very difficult decisions about how to approach these things. And again, get back to it's all these prudential judgments. And I think there's a lot that people have in common, but we tend to scream these slogans,
label
right?
Assume.
But I think at the end of the day, all people want, I think, a planet that's healthier, and they want people to be thriving and have a thriving economy. And then it comes down to how do you do that best?
Yeah. Well, thanks for tackling these tough topics. And I want to remind our listeners and viewers that if you have a question, you can submit them for Dr. Dan Kuebler to answer here at the office hours segment of the podcast. You can email info@magicenter.com. You can also go ahead, give us a call, leave a voicemail. You might hear your own voice right on this podcast. You can call 949-257-2436. But until next time, make sure to subscribe to Purposeful Lab on your favorite podcast platform and find out the latest of what's happening at the podcast at magicenter.com. That does it for now. We'll see you next week.